Day 48, North Sydney to Red Rocks. I woke up with a jolt. It was a little bit later than the time I would normally wake up. Some businesses were already open. I gathered myself and fired up my beast. I headed over to Tim Hortons to grab breakfast. Remembering the wonderful couple who recommended travel guides from CAA, I walked into Tim Hortons and sat down to study what places to visit in Newfoundland. Looking over the guides, I then realized how much I missed due to my sense of random and spontaneous adventure. While I certainly didn't regret my experiences, I definitely missed a lot. I had numerous travel guides which I haven't even taken time to view while on the road, and I had these guides since my trip leaving St. John, New Brunswick. As I sat down, I forgot that I was in Atlantic Canada. I left my phone and belongings at the table while I was waiting for my food, and I kept an eye on everything to prevent theft. This was something normal in Canada's urban centers. Then I realized that the possibility of theft was near zero, as this was a small city in Cape Breton Island, far away from the thieving hands and sticky fingers of Winnipeg and Vancouver. As I sat down and began to study the sights across Newfoundland, a group of gentlemen began a conversation with me. Again, I forgot that this was Atlantic Canada, as in Vancouver this would never have happened. They asked me where in British Columbia I was from and what my plans were. They told me that if I had any questions, they would be more than happy to answer. They noticed me pull in and the British Columbia plates on my beast. I did chat with them for a little while as we spoke about the ferry heading across to Port Aux Basques. One of the gentlemen there had a lot of profanity in his vocabulary. While he didn't come across as uncivilized or low class in particular, I remembered how here in Atlantic Canada everyone had ties to the ocean, so there were sailors amongst us. I finished my breakfast, thanked the group of gentlemen for their assistance, and headed back to my beast. I then drove over to the North Sydney Ferry Terminal. I was excited to get on my way as I had never been to Newfoundland, and everything I read about earlier excited me. As instructed, I arrived quite early. I was advised to be between 1 to 2 hours earlier than departure, and I was right on 8 o'clock as my departure time was 10 o'clock. As I pulled up to the gate, the attendant addressed me by my name, without me even showing him my identification. I was quite surprised, and I asked him how he knew who I was. He told me his passenger list indicated the origins of all the passengers, and I was the only one coming in from British Columbia. He also told me he used to live in British Columbia some time ago, and we shared a few stories. It was a great laugh, and I was already at a pleasant start of my day with everyone being so friendly here on Cape Breton Island. I pulled into my place, exited my vehicle, and walked around a bit. There were already other people who arrived before me, but not many. In the distance, I could see the two ferries that would be disembarking for Newfoundland. One was the MV Blue Puttees heading to Port Aux Basques, an 8-hour ferry ride to Western Newfoundland. The other was the MV Leif Ericson, heading to Argentia on Eastern Newfoundland, which was a 16-hour ferry ride. I was used to taking the ferry back on Vancouver Island from Schwartz Bay to Tsawwassen. I had never been on a ferry that took this long and was out in the open ocean. Eventually, the parking lot started to fill up, and then we began driving up into the ferry. The setup of the ferry was such that the lorries shared the same cargo compartment as the regular passenger vehicles, and that no one could remain in their vehicle during the trip. I seen a lot of people taking blankets and pillows with them. I only took my essentials and left everything in my beast. I was instructed to head to the upper deck along with many of the passengers. While the ferry itself was dated compared to the newer ferries in operation around Vancouver Island, it was still a very nice ferry. I found my seat that I was assigned, and I was quite surprised by how spacious it was. By no means am I a small person or even average person in size, and I found the seating area similar to what I would find on a business class flight. I propped myself in such a manner that I would feel comfortable, and peered out the window. The weather was beautiful, and for now it was calm. The ship shook slightly and began to hum as the diesel engines fired up. The sister ferry, the MV Leif Ericson, had already begun leaving port to begin its 16-hour trip to Argentia. Some interesting thoughts crossed my mind, as they normally did, about what I would do in an emergency. I familiarized myself with the layout of the ship, where the emergency exits were, and how to reach the lifeboats. Since I had a window seat, I could generally tell where I needed to go. I walked around the cabin until finding a lineup leading to a small cafeteria. Like any other ferry, the prices of food and beverage were well over double what I could have paid for on land. While I did bring up some food with me, I didn't bring enough for a full lunch or dinner. While I was in the lineup, I was quite happy to see a completely different environment from the West Coast. Complete strangers were speaking to each other, and everyone was polite. I spoke to one of the attendants and asked him about his ferry experience. He said he had lived on Cape Breton Island his entire life and had been serving on Marine Atlantic for many years. He seemed quite surprised that I was from British Columbia, and that my ferry trips from Victoria to Vancouver were slightly longer than an hour and a half. Eventually, I reached the point where I could order some food, and I opted for several slices of pizza. I headed back to my seat, where I sat down and began scrolling on the internet. The pizza itself was worse than convenience store pizza, worse than ready-made pizza, and worse than anything on the trip I've had so far that cost this much. Given how I had such incredible seafood around Cape Breton yesterday, at Morrison's restaurant and the Rusty Anchor, I knew that I was more than likely spoiled. But this was Atlantic Canada, not the West Coast, so people here were much more grateful for what little they had. And while this was far from even average pizza, it was enough to keep most people happy. Unfortunately, it was just at a price that would make one of those who were truly desperate want to consume this combination of cardboard and tomato paste. As I returned to my seat, the engines of the ferry revved up as we began to leave port. It was rather slow, as I expected, but eventually we were well on our way. Looking out, I could see the mainland of Cape Breton Island begin to disappear. I continued to explore the floors of the ship, at least the areas that I was permitted to enter. I did come out to the open deck for a while, just to take in the views when we were out on the open ocean. It was extremely windy, so I only walked out for a short period of time. Then I returned to my seat. The internet access eventually died out, and while the ship itself technically had internet access, it was so poor it may as well not advertise internet access at all. I preoccupied myself by reading more about Newfoundland, editing some of my videos and going over the photos I had throughout the trip. I had to reflect on everything so far, and how grateful I should have been for being able to experience this once-in-a-lifetime adventure. I began in Victoria, remembering vividly how I drove onto the ferry leaving Vancouver Island and my drive to Lumbee on my first day. I remembered how I had to skip Banff, Jasper, and everything in Alberta due to the wildfires. I remembered walking around Calgary and Edmonton, and then finally rocketing my way towards Toronto. I remembered stopping in Moose Jaw and having the best Thai food I've had in nearly 20 years. I remember driving through the boring-ass prairie provinces until I reached northwestern Ontario, where I stopped in Thunder Bay and Sault Ste. Marie before finally reaching Toronto. I remembered how exciting and full of life Toronto was, and getting lost walking around the ghettos at night, wearing my cowboy hat and carrying my camera like an idiot. I remembered going to the CN Tower Walk, and how I found my purpose in life on that tower. I remembered visiting Ottawa for the first time, and how underrated of a city it was. Its various parks, monuments, and overall cleanliness made me proud of it being the nation's capital city. I remembered visiting Montreal, where every day was an adventure and everyone around me was living a dream. I remember some cracked out homie trying to chat me up and trying to get me to buy drugs with him when I was eating donair and waiting for my laundry to finish. Montreal was mad, chaotic, and exciting. I remembered leaving Montreal for Quebec City, my favorite city in all of Canada, where I hadn't been in for so long. I remembered my entire adventure throughout Atlantic Canada so far, returning to my home province of Nova Scotia. Here I was on the MV Blue Puttees on my way to Newfoundland, a province that I had never been to before, and I was truly excited. I was grateful for everything that I had experienced so far, and excited for anything that I would come to experience in the future. Interestingly, the ship swayed around a lot, much more than I expected. The attendant earlier told me that sometimes they had to cancel the sailing when the weather was just too poor, similar to what I experienced in living in Victoria. But this was some serious swaying. The boat was being tossed around a lot, and I thought of the worst ferry ride I ever took back on BC ferries, and it was nothing compared to being here on Marine Atlantic's route. After some time, it began to get dark. I peered out of the windows and began to see land in the distance. People began waking up from their slumber and preparing to disembark. I gathered my belongings as we were arriving, and I also started filming. A gentleman advised me that I should film on the other side of the ship as the views were much better. I thanked him for his recommendation, and he was certainly correct. Eventually, the loudspeaker announced that we were at port and that we had to begin returning to our vehicles to disembark. I returned to my beast, fired her up when everyone else started their vehicles, and slowly we began to exit the ship. I waved to the flaggers who guided us out of the ferry, and finally I set foot on Newfoundland soil. I drove over to the first Tim Hortons I could find just outside of the ferry terminal. I ordered my dinner, again some horrible processed filth, and began to research where I could car camp for the evening. After filling myself with preservative and synthetic meat, I found the Cape Breton Lighthouse. I drove down to the Cape Breton Lighthouse just as the sun was beginning to set. According to iOverlander, the stealth car camping app that I used, I could car camp at the top of the hill overlooking the ocean. There were residences all around, and I didn't think it would be stealth car camping at all, as my vehicle would be parked on top of a hill for everyone to see. I noticed a small fox, apparently famous for living up on this hill, and while I thought it was cool, I didn't want to get bitten and then having to get a shot for rabies. I searched again for another place to car camp and found something just off Trans-Canada Highway number 1. I was driving at night, and I found the spot easily, as there were a few others parked in this area as well. By now, the midnight sky had set in. It was dark and there was no light pollution. Unlike other areas in Canada, the highways here were not lit up, at least this section of highway, as this was my first evening on Newfoundland. The ocean was to my left, and the mountains were to my right. There was a bit of highway noise from vehicles driving by, but there was also the sound of waves crashing against the shore. I looked up at the sky and I could see the stars, something that I had noticed on my first evening sleeping in a tent back in Lumbee. I settled for the evening, reflecting on this wonderful day. I was finally here, Newfoundland, the last province for me to visit. It didn't take long for me to fall asleep to the stars above me and the waves beside me, and the aura of happiness are all around me. Thank you for sharing in my experience. If you enjoyed my video, please consider subscribing to my channel. I would truly appreciate you sharing my video on your social network, as it helps my channel grow. Be sure to check my playlist to see different categories on my exciting adventures I'm sharing with the world. Life is an adventure. Let's share this experience together.